But we turn now to developments in the cases involving the ex-president because it is now official. His trial on charges of plotting a coup against the government he leads has been postponed. Many have suspected for some time now that Trump arguing in the courts that he is immune from prosecution means that it's all but impossible to start a trial on March 4th, just over a month from now. But that news could clear the way for another one of Trump's criminal cases. The ex-president could be in a courtroom in Manhattan just 8 weeks from now. Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's case charging him with 34 felony counts for trying to cover up a sex scandal in the weeks before the 2016 election. That trial is currently scheduled for March 25th, and in less than 2 weeks, Judge Juan Merchan will hold a hearing to decide if that date holds. According to reporting from the New York Times, Alvin Bragg and his team of prosecutors have been quietly plugging away as the federal cases take up the public's attention. Last month, the Times reported, quote, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has begun to approach witnesses to prepare them for trial, including Michael D. Cohen, Mr. Trump's former fixer. And news breaking just yesterday in a related case that could give Bragg a boost. Once again, from the New York Times, Alan H. Weisselberg, a longtime lieutenant to Donald J. Trump, is negotiating a deal with Manhattan prosecutors that would require him to plead guilty to perjury. As part of the potential agreement with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, Mr. Weisselberg would have to admit that he lied on the witness stand in Mr. Trump's recent civil fraud trial, people said. Mr. Weisselberg, the former chief financial officer at Mr. Trump's family business, also would have to say that he lied under oath during an interview with the New York Attorney General's office, which brought the civil fraud case. A former Trump Organization employee once said that Weisselberg, quote, knows where all the financial bodies are buried. And while the plea agreement reportedly does not involve Weisselberg flipping on his boss, there could be other benefits for the Manhattan DA. Here's how the New York Times put it. Although the potential agreement is unlikely to immediately affect Mr. Trump, it could strengthen Mr. Bragg's hand before the former president's trial. It could deter other witnesses in Mr. Trump's circle from lying on the stand. And perjury charges could discredit Mr. Weisselberg, who has disputed details of the prosecution's evidence in the case involving the 2016 election. And that is where we start today with MSNBC legal analysts Andrew Weissmann and Lisa Rubin, plus Reverend Al Sharpton, president of the National Action Network and host of Politics Nation right here on MSNBC. Lisa, let's start with you. Talk us through this potential plea agreement. Any idea why exactly Weisselberg would be pleading guilty to perjury?
So, Alicia, I have some idea, but certainly it hasn't been definitively established what Weisselberg would be pleading guilty to. First of all, let's establish what case it is that Weisselberg allegedly perjured himself in. It's not the case in which he testified last year, where the Trump Organization itself was charged with criminal tax violations. It's this ongoing case before Judge Engoron, that New York Attorney General's civil fraud trial, in which Weisselberg was not only a witness, he is a defendant. Mr. Weisselberg got on the stand at the calling of the New York Attorney General. He was not a witness for the Trump team. And in that testimony, he said that he really didn't know very much about the valuation and even the assignment of square footage to Trump's triplex apartment at Trump Tower. You'll remember that infamously, Trump tried to value that apartment based on it having 33,000 square feet. In actuality, it has almost 11,000 square feet. That tripling of the square footage was a key variable in enabling former President Trump and those around him to bump up the value of that apartment substantially. And Mr. Weisselberg is alleged to have been intimately involved in that. However, on the stand, he said he wasn't involved in that valuation, nor did he really communicate with outsiders asking about that. That includes reporters from Forbes magazine, including one, Dana Alexander, who had not only communicated directly with Weisselberg, but was sitting in the gallery of the courtroom when Mr. Weisselberg was on the stand. And sure enough, very soon thereafter, he said, Weisselberg lied on the stand and we have receipts. Here are some of the things we know that he said to us. Almost immediately thereafter, Weisselberg's testimony was further called off. He was supposed to return to the stand a day later after an interruption for another witness. And then when he was supposed to come back, he didn't. And many people expect that's because he was caught perjuring himself. So that's what we think is going on. Alicia, I also want to clarify, though, that while these negotiations are reportedly underway, according to the New York Times and others, we don't have reason to believe that they have been conclusively finalized. That is, there is no plea agreement yet. Rather, our best understanding, based on others' reporting, is that there are only discussions.
Andrew, help me understand how this plays out, what you make of this. Would a plea take an important chess piece off the board for Trump's defense in the Bragg case?
Yeah, there's no question that this would be a very bad development for Donald Trump in two ways. Directly and, as you sort of intimated, in a third way, sort of indirectly. So the direct ways is, as Lisa said, this is a very bad development in terms of the civil fraud case that is pending, where we're awaiting a decision by Judge Engoron. I strongly suspect that the reason for the delay in that decision coming out is because Judge Engoron is waiting to see what happens with respect to Allen Weisselberg, who was, after all, a witness in his trial in civil court. So we're waiting to see what happens there. So that is sort of makes it very hard for Donald Trump to use that testimony as something to exculpate him and to say, I didn't commit the civil fraud, if Allen Weisselberg is going to say that, in fact, he lied just several weeks ago before the judge. Second, in the Manhattan criminal case, to the extent that Allen Weisselberg was a potential witness for Donald Trump to refute any part of the case, he still might be called by Donald Trump, but his credibility will have taken this enormous hit, because he will have to say, not only did I plead guilty to this very lengthy tax fraud where the Trump Organization, as Lisa mentioned, was convicted, but he himself pled guilty to that. And then even after that, he committed a crime by taking a stand and lying under oath. So his credibility is shot. And then the third way, which I'm really very familiar with, is it's very important for prosecutors, when they can show that somebody is lying, has either lied in an interview or lied under oath, to bring those cases, to vindicate the system. Why? Because that's sort of the bread and butter of how cases are made. And it really sends a deterrent message to other witnesses that if you hop on the stand and lie, there are consequences. So there is this sort of intangible way that I think in many ways may be the most important, that it really prevents people from taking a stand and just willy-nilly thinking they can get away with saying anything that the defendant wants to hear.
Lisa, you did such a good job setting the table for us, the ways in which Weisselberg's history with the cases involving Trump and the Trump Organization have played out. To remind folks, Alvin Bragg didn't appear to need him to bring charges against Trump. Did he go around him to bring the hush money case?
You know, he did go around him in some ways, Alicia, in the sense that he didn't need his testimony. However, if you look at that indictment against former President Trump that the Manhattan DA's office brought last April, it really breaks down into two arguments. There's an indictment, which just lists the charges, and then there's a corresponding statement of fact, which is the sort of narrative we're used to seeing in a federal indictment that we might refer to as a speaking indictment. Allen Weisselberg is all over those facts. He is, according to lawyer A, who we understand to be Michael Cohen, in fact, sort of the mastermind of the reimbursement scheme. When Michael Cohen discusses that reimbursement scheme with Trump, according to the indictment, he says, I've discussed this with the CFO. And again, throughout that indictment, you see indicia that the CFO agreed to these charges, that he even signed some of the checks, because at one point, after Trump becomes president, the trustees of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust are no longer Trump himself. They are one of his sons, Don Jr., his co-trustee, Allen Weisselberg. The two of them sign a reimbursement check from his invoice to Michael Cohen. So do they need Michael Cohen to make their, do they need Allen Weisselberg to make their case? No, but his name and his participation is an endemic part of this case. And so to the extent that they can then convince, as part of a plea agreement, Allen Weisselberg to attest to his complicity in this, that will make this case much stronger and insulate them from the criticism as the Attorney General was criticized for being so reliant on Michael Cohen, who himself has some trouble with the truth, and admittedly so. And that makes him a difficult witness. So to the extent that the DA can sort of broaden their case, broaden the fact witnesses, the people who are in the room with Donald Trump as part of this hush money scheme to include Allen Weisselberg, that's all the better for Alvin Bragg and his team, Alicia.
Rev, part of the reason we wanted to have you on is because you've interviewed Bragg a few times. Your sense, Rev, of how Bragg is approaching this case, knowing it is historic, knowing it is unprecedented, knowing it could be the case of his career.
I think that people underestimate Alvin Bragg in terms of his work ethic and in terms of his being a very deliberate person. And I did not think that if he went forward with any case, he would not make sure that his prosecutors and investigators have done everything possible and then some to make sure that he wasn't bringing something just to be bringing it. He's not a headline hunter. He's not a guy that wants to be a household name. He is a lawyer that happened to have won to be the district attorney in Manhattan. So I think if I were being prosecuted by Alvin Bragg, I'd be very concerned, because if you remember, he was criticized early for not bringing cases quickly enough. And then all of a sudden he did bring the cases, which means that he was convinced that they had a solid case. Now, if Weisselberg now comes and begins to cooperate with the fraud case that has already been determined in the state attorney general's favor, we just don't know the penalties. But certainly Weisselberg can add to whatever the judge is considering there. That only strengthens the hand of whatever the outcome of the damages are in the fraud case with the attorney general. And it strengthens Bragg's case if, in fact, Weisselberg is brought into court. So I think that Donald Trump is seeing the wagon circle around he and his attorneys.